Hey everyone, I'm Evan and welcome to another episode of the ProfNoctis Show. This week we have very popular and very fun Twitch streamers Droogle and Shoop on the show, and we're just so excited to get to share some of that conversation with you. As always, make sure that you're liking and subscribing. We have a podcast wherever you find your podcast versions. It's just an audio-only format, and it really helps us out, even if you would just subscribe, even if you watch on YouTube. So thanks for doing that to support the channel. Wade, what can we look forward to with our episode with Droogle and Shoop?
Today, our guests go into their backstory and let us know a little bit about their content creation journey, which is really important because it frames their perceptions and their opinions about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. So the back end is all Rebirth. We're talking about some of the key story sequences, but to really frame it, we try to get into the ins and outs of their own personal lives on the front end. So you got a packed episode today. Hope you enjoy it. And with that, let's mosey. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the ProfNoctis Show. I am here as usual with Evan, but today we are delighted to have two very special guests, two fellow content creators, streamers, and just two all-around great people. Yeah. We have Droogle and Shoop. How you doing today?
Welcome.
Fantastic. Excited to be here. Thank you so much for including us.
I'm awesome. I'm excited.
These two have been some of the just greatest treasures that I've found since starting this Final Fantasy content creation journey. I got to meet both of them at PAX East up in Boston, and that was our first time really interacting. But since then, I've been following your stuff. You even had me on a game show one night, which was a ton of fun. Got to talk some Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and just two of the best people out there. And we're really excited to get to know you today. So thank you so much for being on.
Thank you. No,
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
So excited to talk more VII Rebirth. Whenever I get the chance to talk more VII Rebirth, I will take the opportunity.
You are in the right place. He can't.
You are in the right place.
Let's go. Let's go.
I gotta say, right off the bat, Shoop, you recently just finished Rebirth, though, right?
I did not actually.
Oh, you didn't?
A little fun fact of the day is that I have not physically put my hands on Rebirth. So I'm going to be speaking from my perspective as an audience member, someone who watched the entire playthrough and moderated a full playthrough on Twitch.
There you go. So you've seen and you've reacted to Rebirth, but without
my
playing
entire playthrough.
I have it. I do have it, but I'm going to be playing everything in order on stream. So I'm still holding on to it.
This is great because that means we'll just have to have you back on once you've played it yourself and have some different. Good, see if your opinion changed at all when it was a little more hands-on. So this is great. Now we get
to
research.
It'll be great.
My anxiety is extremely high for when that happens because I love Rebirth so much that I was like, oh, I hope she likes it as much as I do, because Shoop will talk about this, I'm sure, at some point, but her history with Seven is somewhat, I don't know what to call it.
We'll say it's different than yours.
Yes, it's different.
Very different than yours.
Let's just go
different. Different is good. Speaking of different, you guys are obviously hanging out together here, and you guys have an interesting story a little bit.
That's not true. I'm in a studio. What are you talking about?
Sorry. About how you guys maybe met. But before we get into that, I'd love to talk about your history with Twitch and video games in general. You were kind of early on the Twitch train, Droogle, I know. So can you tell us a little bit about kind of what your journey has been, and then we'll kind of go from there?
Yeah, it started about 11 years ago. And I'm actually going to be celebrating next month 10 years as a partner on Twitch, which I'm really excited about.
Very nice.
Yeah, I'm so excited about that. We're going to be celebrating on the front page and everything, so I'm really excited about that. But God, when I started 11 years ago, I didn't even know what being a partner meant. I didn't know what Twitch was when PS4 came out in the end of 2013, right? And I received the console and I booted up and I saw the Twitch app. And of course, I signed up for it, and I saw there was this live from PlayStation feature. It was the first time that you could stream from a console. And I also had the PlayStation camera that I ordered with the PS4 at the time. So I'm looking at what everybody's doing, and everybody's, of course, streaming themselves playing games. Meanwhile, my first thought is somebody who wanted so badly for the longest time to get into podcasting, get into discussion on video games in the industry. I'm like, wait a second, like this would be the perfect opportunity to put the camera up, just have it on me without any game, and just stream myself talking games. And at the time, there was an application on the PlayStation 4 called Playroom. And now it's been extrapolated to become Astrobot, Astro's Playroom, and all that. But back then it was just the Playroom. And that was the introduction of Astrobot, actually. But it was an AR, augmented reality app. So it was an opportunity to just put a camera on myself without anything but the UI stuff of the Playroom and talk with people. And I set up a Google number and I took calls, and I spent the night talking with people about the PS4 launch. And that night I hit 800 viewers concurrently watching me live. Now,
wow.
I don't even know what that means at the time, right? I'm just like, oh, this is cool. We're talking
doing
to
a
people.
call-in show. I love that.
I had no idea that from that moment forward, I would never hit 800 viewers concurrently again. That was the only time.
Day of my life, and I didn't know it.
I had no idea. I had no idea. So from that moment, I was like, ooh, light bulb went off. Called up my buddy at the time, and I was like, yo, we've always wanted to do podcasting. Like, this is it. We got to get over here next week. We got to do this like weekly. So we set up the Level Up Show. I set up a new Twitch account called the Level Up Show, and we did a talk show every Sunday for 300 episodes.
Wow.
Doing the Level Up Show. And as I was saying, with a partnership, I got partnered on Twitch like 8 months later, and I didn't even know what it meant. It was such a different time on Twitch, right? Like it was like, oh, you should be a partner. People were telling me. I was like, okay, sure, why not? Email Twitch. Hey, can we be a partner? Next day, you're a partner. It was just, it was so,
what a different world.
What a different world.
It was so different back then.
There was no affiliate back then.
Yeah. Such a different time. And it really was the Wild West, because in the months leading up to that, I actually got banned from Twitch like 4 different times because we were streaming non-gaming content.
So just chatting wasn't
it wasn't a thing. They didn't have
Wow.
podcasts and talk shows. They didn't have podcasting. They had none of that. They had no just chatting. All this was non-existent at the time. It was you have to be playing a game. There has to be a game. So every time we would do the talk show, we were always in fear of like, are they going to ban us again? Are they going to ban us again? Happened 4 times, and we were able each time to get them to remove it. And then finally, we talked with a certain individual on Twitch, and they're like, you know what? Enough is enough. We're going to whitelist you. So nobody bans you again. You guys are doing gaming content as a talk show. You're whitelisted. This won't happen again. So, and then of course, a year after that or so, suddenly it blew up. Podcasts and talk shows became a thing. You've got Kind of Funny. You got Giant Bomb. You got all these amazing productions coming onto Twitch to do podcasts and talk show, and it blew up.
That is so cool. Shoop, what about you? How did you find out about Twitch? What made you want to start streaming? What did you stream? Were you playing games? Were you also doing a Astro's Playroom VR talk show?
I also started streaming like a decade ago. No, I did not. I have been streaming for about 2.5 years, so I am still very much a toddler on Twitch. I started streaming. So actually, originally, I take this back. So I did create my account in 2019. I streamed for a very brief time to one single viewer, and that was my nephew.
Shout out nephew.
Yeah, that nephew was my number one from day one, and I would stream games for him when my brother was ill. My brother passed from cancer in 2019.
Sorry to hear that.
And no, it's something I've come to terms with. But I would stream games to my nephew and keep him entertained, while my brother was sick. And after my brother passed, I did not stream at all. I mean, I could tell you, I could count on 2 hands how many times I streamed that year, and it was just to my nephew. And then I returned to Twitch in January of 2022. And I had moved to somewhere that I did not know anybody. I had moved to West Virginia, and the only people I knew were my coworkers at the place that I worked at the time. And they were not very interesting people, or if they were, we had nothing in common. So I started streaming to find people who enjoyed the same things that I did.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, and I started with Kingdom Hearts. That was the first story game that I played, was the original Kingdom Hearts. And I met several wonderful people. I also met several people that I had to ban later on.
That can happen.
Can happen. And then I started playing Final Fantasy because that's where my love is. That is where my heart is. And I started streaming Final Fantasy X, which is where my namesake is from. And I met a lot of my friends today from streaming Final Fantasy X. And since then, I've streamed several I've streamed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, partially 8. I'll get into that later.
Okay.
9, speedrun Excalibur 2 run of 9, 10, 10 2, and 16. And eventually I'll play 15 on stream as well, Noctis, I
One day.
promise. But
That's
one
fair. I'll
day.
join you. I'll help you through it.
Yeah.
A lot
So
of people need a guide.
I know I'm looking forward to it because I played 15 when it first came out before it was even finished.
Sure.
So,
Sure.
but yeah, that's my one true love is the Final Fantasy series, and I'm looking forward to expanding into other RPGs, especially JRPGs in the future. But I also have a big spot in my heart for indie games, and especially Journey. If you've never played Journey,
Yeah.
excellent game, and I really like to highlight some of the artistic and visual storytelling that might get overlooked compared to a lot of bigger names and titles and such.
Yeah.
So.
Real quick, Shoop, for our audience, you mentioned that your name comes from Final Fantasy X. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about that. What is it?
Ride the Shoop-Puff. So everybody in my community.
Good impersonation.
Yeah, thank you. And my close friends call me Shoop. That just kind of became my nickname within the first 6 months that I started on Twitch. But my full name, if anybody wants to find me, you're not going to find me under Shoop. You're going to find me under Ride Z Shoop-Puff.
Ride Z Shoop-Puff.
Ride
Good.
Z
With the
Shoop-Puff.
ZE. Yeah.
Yes. And there are a lot of imposter Ride Z Shoop-Puffs on Twitch, I promise. I'm the only one that spelled it.
I found
right.
them. Yeah. As I was first looking you up, I found all the imposters. I was like, who is this?
They've been gifted subs in my channel several times. And one person showed up the other day.
Hey, there you go.
Imitation.
It's like the Spider-Man meme.
Flattery, something about that.
And worth mentioning too, that that's how we met too. Final Fantasy X is how the two of us met. So
We'd
one of the
love to
best
hear
things
that
that
story.
happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I said, like I streamed for a long time as the Level Up Show, but once my co-hosts at the time went off and did their own separate things, they just moved on from Twitch, I should say. They didn't stay on Twitch. They just kind of were done with it. I needed to figure out what was next, and I rebranded. I rebranded as Droogle as I am now, and I decided to really focus on also my love, as Shoop says, Final Fantasy is what I grew up with. It's really been a life-defining, sort of character-defining thing for me. So, and I kind of told myself when I rebranded, I was like, I'm not going to be the way I used to be. I'm going to start watching other streamers. I'm going to start trying to connect with other people. And that's what I did. So I started traveling a lot of Final Fantasy streams, and Jin Ray, who Shoop mentioned pre-show, who has become one of our great friends through Twitch. We were both sitting in his chat watching him struggle on one of the final bosses of Final Fantasy X for many, many hours. And
6 hours.
we just started kind of chatting with each other. I didn't realize anything. I didn't know anything about Shoop at the time. I didn't know that she was a streamer. I didn't know that she was a woman. I didn't know anything about her, but we started connecting after that stream. And since then, now she's living with me. You guys can't tell, but she's back there behind the green screen. So yeah, the illusion's broken. Yeah.
Shoop,
So
what was
now
that
we're
like for you.
Yeah.
Well, okay, I will fully admit that I pursued him. Let me just a disclaimer since we're on this topic. Disclaimer: Twitch is not a dating site. It's very similar to like you just happen to run into somebody at like a running club or a chess club or whatever. We just happen to meet on Twitch. Please do not go pursue parasocial relationships with people that you might not actually connect with in that way. We just happen to connect that way.
Too late. Twitch. If you're saying people on terminally online people on Twitch should not have parasocial relationships, that whole platform is built on parasocial relationships. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but
it's like what Rihanna always said. Twitch may be a hopeless place, but you can find love in a hopeless place.
Yeah, you know what? I think that's
there you
right.
go.
That's
Thank you, Rihanna.
Way.
That was beautiful.
Way to bring
thing
it
is like I had been when Drew and I met, I was going through a tough time and he was also going through a tough time, and we were able to be very honest and vulnerable with each other, and he helped me with some things and I helped him with some things, and we had a great, I'd say friendship before pursuing anything further. And I mean, obviously now, like, almost 3 years later, we live together and life is great, and we are still a bunch of Final Fantasy nerds. Now we just live under the same roof.
Well, would you feel comfortable sharing a little bit about like what was it like to transition from like knowing someone online to in person? Because that sounds like an interesting story.
I can detail a little bit about like the first time we met in person.
Okay.
We had agreed that he would come visit me for the first time.
Okay.
And so me, a complete nervous wreck, I was like deep cleaning my house. I looked like I was on amphetamines or something because I'm like cleaning the baseboards. I'm like, he can't notice like a speck of dust that I live in this place.
Yeah.
It's the crazy thinking.
Did you
It's
apologize
like moms
for
with guests.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you apologize for the mess when he came over? Even though
Of course,
you
even
have
though
to.
there was no mess. Yeah.
Oh, please
But,
excuse
okay,
the mess. I'm so sorry. I've only spent 2 weeks cleaning.
So he shows up. And I've told people this on stream before, because for whatever reason, I've been told that I give off tall energy, whatever that may mean.
Okay.
So he shows up at the door, and I open very, very, very timidly, open the door like, hi. And the first thing he says to me is, you really are tiny.
I did not say it like that or with that face.
You said it.
I must defend myself here. So first off, I did agree at the time that Shoop does give off tall energy. And the reason is because she's got a long torso, you know,
long torso,
and you only
yeah.
see it. You only see torso
Right.
on Twitch. You don't see her short little legs.
I do.
So,
have legs.
but she did tell me before I met her, she told me that she was 5'3". And I was like, okay, she's 5'3". But I was not prepared. I was not prepared
You're not
for
prepared
how
for the
short
scale
5'3"
of
is, I guess. I don't know.
5'3"?
I guess I thought 5'3" was taller. I don't know. I'm 6'1". So when I met her, I was like, oh, you are tiny. Yes, it was the first thing I said. But I said it in more in like, oh, you are tiny kind of way. Not like
an armrest.
No,
on
I
didn't say it like that.
An armrest.
Well, we
The
had
first time, yeah.
We had BioRoxas on, who is a VTuber, and BioRoxas doesn't have legs, so that he's all torso.
That's what we learned from
All
the little
torso.
VTuber thing.
Yeah.
All torso.
All torso.
Yeah, the first time when I did a stream where I got to introduce Drew, and of course everybody was like, "Oh my god, are you two a thing?" As if people didn't already somewhat guess.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, "Yeah," and they're like, "Well, let me see how tall you are next to each other," kind of thing. So Drew and I are sitting next to one another. I barely come up to his shoulder, and he just, I'm just an armrest.
Perfect
I
height.
love that.
Yeah, but it is kind of weird, like when you because on camera, people can really, especially online, obviously, can really perfect themselves with filters or lighting or studio fixes, things like that.
Right.
And so even though you're still in, it's a live stream and stuff, you can still make yourself look more camera ready than when you're in person.
Mhm.
So I will say I was concerned that when he showed up to my house that I was going to be catfished. He looks the same.
You should know that the beard is fake.
The beard is fake. It's part of the studio.
It's painted
Added
on.
in post.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
great.
Drew, any other community tips that you might have?
So if we were just kind of talking about general, like, hey, I want to get into streaming and all of that as well. What I would say is, there's so many different outlooks on this. A lot of people will be like, do variety. No, do one game. And there's no one true answer to that. For me, I think it's be wary of what you are setting as your template, I guess, moving forward, your brand, I guess is a good way to put it. Because if from the very beginning, you do decide, I'm going to be a variety streamer, I'm going to do this all the way, and that becomes your thing, when you switch from that, if you decide to switch from that, it can be a start from zero type moment. And I think that's especially true if you are, hey, I'm going to be a Final Fantasy streamer and only a Final Fantasy streamer.
Mhm.
You do that for 2 years, you've gone through every single Final Fantasy game, you've done speed runs, you've done modded runs, and you're like, what do I do now?
Right.
And you're like, you know what? I'll do Zelda. Suddenly, half your community is gone. So you have to really decide, like, okay, what am I going to be? And what's my brand going to be? And set up maybe even some backups in a way. Like for me, I've always been a variety streamer, but I would say I've focused on specific genres or specific series, but I've always been like a 2 series at a time type thing. Like right now I'm doing Astrobot as my one game, but then I'm doing a full series playthrough of Kingdom Hearts. And then I'll never do one thing almost ever at like a whole week. The only time I did that was Rebirth because I was so obsessed with it.
Yeah.
But normally I want to switch it up between 2 different genres or 2 different series, so that I'm continuing to bring in lots of people. And then I also want to be somebody that's known to just discuss games, love games, love the industry, want to talk about it. Because then you just bring in anybody that likes to be a part of that conversation. So keep that in mind, like which crowds you're drawing in. And that it sucks, but it's the truth. You're probably going to lose a large portion of those when you're no longer catering to their specific desires
Right.
on Twitch. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with a Kingdom Hearts fanatic only wanting to watch Kingdom Hearts streams. It's just the way it is.
Yep.
You need to understand that before you start deciding, I'm only going to stream Kingdom Hearts. Really think about 2, 3, 5 years from now, what you want to be on Twitch, because it's going to change.
I mean, I went through that, and I've had this discussion very openly with my little corner of the internet. That when I started, obviously, like, I took off very quickly. I grew very quickly in my first year. It has since been a much slower growth because I'm not playing Final Fantasy X nonstop. Like, I experienced a lot of growth during my first on-stream playthrough of Final Fantasy X, and I could tell you, if y'all ever do a Final Fantasy X episode, please call me, because I can tell you literally everything about it. But I mean, that's not all of who I am. Yeah, my namesake is from there, and it's my second favorite game of all time, but that's not all me. And I love, and I mean absolutely love visual novels, but in video game form. And I love sharing that with people. And are the same people going to be there for Final Fantasy first playthroughs, especially? Because people are obsessed with always being there for a first playthrough. The same people are not always going to be there for a non-verbal, visual, artsy, you know what I mean? And that's okay. My thing is that I will always just share what I love. And if people want to be there for my very emotional reactions to something that I love, then that's great. But that's always going to be who I am. Is if something makes me cry, I want to play it. That's just me.
And also, real quick, just to elaborate on one thing I said earlier, you are going to see those ups and downs. You're going to have months, especially during the summer, where your numbers plummet. People are doing things, they're on vacation, and it can really affect your mental health when you go from 50 people watching you down to 15 people watching you. You're going to question, is it me? What am I doing? Why don't people want to watch me? You're going to go through all of it. You're going to doubt yourself and all this, but you just need to remember that those ups and downs are going to exist. As long as you are still having a good time doing what you're doing, just power through those moments and come out on the other side, because that's streaming. It's the ups and downs, the ebbs and flow. And if you are a full-time streamer, that's something especially to know. And anybody who is full-time streaming will tell you, as a career, it is not consistent. It certainly is not consistent. I took a whole year off to try full-time streaming once. I saved up for a full year prior to that. I work as an architect. I took off. I quit my job as an architect after saving money for a full year to give full-time streaming a shot. And it was awesome. It was one of the best things I ever did. I loved it so much, but it also educated me a lot on what to do and not to do, and what not to expect, certainly, as a full-time streamer. It was tough, man, to watch month after month, numbers go down or go up for 1 month and then go down, to look at, your revenue and see how inconsistent it was, and be like, the fund, this big fund of money that I prepared for this endeavor is running out. It's a lot, it's a big drain on your mental health. So just keep that in mind as well, that I'm so happy now that it's a side gig for me. You know what I mean? It's the cherry on top. It's some extra money on the side. I've got my career, as a project manager, and I do this as something I just love, but also make a little bit of money off of. And if you can find that happy place, then I think you're good.
That's really cool. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about kind of how you got into video games and how you kind of fell in love with them and how that led to the streaming. Did you grow up with video games? Are there some early ones that really stick out to you that you were like, yes, this is the one like that I love and I'm just obsessed with? How old were you? Who introduced you to it? Tell me a little bit about that.
You go first.
Oh, I'm going first. Okay. So yes, I've always been into video games pretty much. I think probably started around like 4 or 5 years old. My first console was the TurboGrafx 16, which I think a lot of people probably don't even know. It was a competitor to the Super Nintendo. It did not do very well. Yeah, but it had some good games, to be honest with you. My parents bought me that as a Christmas present when I was young. But I'd say what really got me into gaming was, shocker, Final Fantasy VII was the thing that did it for me.
Way.
But I have to give a lot of credits to my cousin Ed. So when I was younger, my mom, she would work the late night shift. She was a nurse at a hospital. So even though she was home during those days during the summer,
Mine
She
too.
yes, she would be exhausted, obviously. She has worked a late
Yeah.
night shift. My cousin Ed, bit older than us, old enough that he could come over and watch us during the summers while my mom was resting the late night shift off. And he would bring over his PlayStation and he would introduce us to video games. So of
cool.
course he brings over the PS1, introduces me to Final Fantasy 7 at 9 years old. And it was just, I was already in the movies a lot at that time. I grew up with film. My parents would bring me to the movie theater every single week, sometimes twice a week. I was so into film. And this was the first time that I'd played a video game where I was like, whoa, like characters, music, story, like being invested in this world that takes 40, 50, 100 hours to get through. I was just so blown away by that at the time. And I connected so much with those characters. But I'd say the 1-2 punch for me, and I bring this a lot up on stream, is you had Final Fantasy VII in 1997. And like I said, that introduced me to amazing storytelling in a video game, characters to connect with, world to live in. But then the next year, Metal Gear Solid came out. And that was when I was like, wait a second. I love film. I love movies, voice acting, cinematics. This was where the storytelling blended with the cinematics, right? And the cinematic storytelling came together. And then that was when I was like, okay, I am hooked. Like this is a movie that I'm taking part in. There's a movie that I'm living within. And from that moment forward, it was those are my two favorite series of all time: Final Fantasy, followed by Metal Gear Solid.
Couldn't have picked better ones. Metal Gear, my gosh.
Yeah, so that's really what started for
Psycho
me.
Mantis. That's great.
Let's go.
So, okay. So obviously it's kind of on brand for like what I do on Twitch, ironically. I formed a very emotional connection to gaming to begin with. When I first started gaming, I originally my parents had divorced and my dad ended up eventually getting custody of me. And at the time I was living with him, my grandparents, and then also his younger sister and her husband. So it was a whole house of us.
It's a full house.
And my dad shortly passed after he got custody of me. So my grandparents then took custody of me, but they were old and not fun, at least I thought. They were not old at all. But I wanted to hang out with my aunt and her husband all the time because they were really cool. They were in their early 20s and I was like 9, 10 years old. So my first introduction to real gaming as far as story gaming was Final Fantasy VIII. I did not play the entire game myself. I watched my aunt and uncle play it. And then I played Final Fantasy IX when it came out. And that was the first game, like real game, that I played all the way through by myself. And I loved it. And I loved the coping mechanism that came along with this game. I mean, and Final Fantasy X as well. Like obviously, 9 came out in 2000, but 9 as a little kid, you really don't expect like a 10-year-old to really cope very well with sudden death, especially to a close member of the family, such as a parent. But 9 was basically therapy in a box for me. And I connected so well. I don't want to spoil 9. Obviously, this is not a 9 discussion, I connected.
You can use specific examples if they haven't played Final Fantasy 9 at this point.
Just scrub forward about 30 seconds if you.
Yeah, I would love for you to speak more about what that meant to you and specifics.
Having Vivi coping with his inevitable own death, which I later grew up into studying basically the 5 stages of grief. If y'all don't know about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and like the denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. I bought her book because of Final Fantasy IX because I wanted to learn more about this, like the stages of grief and why I was experiencing what I was experiencing. And my family did not have the education or the resources to walk me through grief. So Final Fantasy kind of did that for me, 9 and 10 especially. But prior to that, I mean, I had played Crash Bandicoot Warped and Spyro and stuff, but it wasn't like where I found my connection. I found my connection with Final Fantasy 9 and 10, and
something that I've never
me through a lot.
actually brought up to you, and I think would be really interesting, especially today if it comes up in discussion, since we're going to be getting so much in the Final Fantasy 7. It makes me really wonder, like, what if Final Fantasy 7 was your first? Because
Question.
because if like Final Fantasy 7, as I think we all know, one of the major themes of Final Fantasy 7 is loss.
Yeah.
And so I really wonder how you would have connected with that one if that was your first.
That's a good question. I don't know if y'all know this or not. I think Wade, you might, but I didn't play Final Fantasy 7 all the way through. I played disc 1 several times, but I didn't play 7 all the way through until the COVID shutdown of 2020.
Yeah.
Because I resented every single person when I would say, I love Final Fantasy. I played 8 and I played 9, I played 10, and they're like, those suck. 7 is the best. Yeah. And I have definitely gotten a lot more enlightened in the 7 department. But for the majority of my childhood, I was told that Final Fantasy 9 was stupid and cartoony by anyone that I was like, hey, this game is really fun.
I was always the same thing. Like, I hated so much when people would tell me that 9 was cartoony and they didn't play it because it was like 7 and 8 were realistic. And then what are you doing with 9? It's so cartoony. I'm like, you are missing out.
It made me resent 7, even though I never played it, because the people that were boasting about it made it seem like every other game sucks.
It's important to know that enjoying things is a competition. Like, and the second that you forget that your enjoyment of something is a competition, we will all be here to remind you that you're only allowed to enjoy things competitively.
I talked about this a lot at the time.
Are you going to talk about 6?
No, I wasn't going to talk about 6. I'm going to stay away from that tonight. I don't want to get canceled. But what I was going to say is, I remember at the time there was this weird thing. I think it was like 2000's Edge or something like that. I don't know what was going on, but 9 wasn't the only one. It was like 9 came after 7 and 8, and people loved like sort of the darkness and the grittiness of 7 and 8, and they loved that it was realistic. So 9 was like, no, it's kiddie and cartoony. Why would I play this? And then it was the same. Like a year later, Legend of Zelda Wind Waker came out, which is like my favorite Zelda game. And everybody was like, what are you doing playing the kiddie game? This one sucks. And then everybody was like all through the moon about Twilight Princess because it was realistic and dark and gritty. I'm like, no, you missed out. Wind Waker was fantastic. So there was just like this weird thing at the time where people just didn't want to even take part in these more light from a visual aspect, because 9,
if you talk about Final Fantasy 9 especially, has probably one of the darkest themes in the entire series.
It's got some dark moments. 9 especially at the end gets very dark. So it's like you're missing out. You are judging a book by its cover to keep it simple, right? Like, no, give these games a chance. They're beautiful and they really have a lot to say.
Well, that's one of the things that I think is interesting about this concept of a 9 remake, right? I wonder if they will lean fully into that cheerful aesthetic. When people ask, what style would you like for 9? I don't think that it would do it justice to make it hyper realistic. I think that it would need to.
We were just talking about that in the car.
Really? I think it would be really interesting if they leaned into something a little bit more Ghibli-esque, something even anime style, something that was highly animated, not cartoonish necessarily, but whimsical.
Maybe a Nino Kuni.
A Nino Kuni,
That's exactly
if you will.
what Drew said in the car. Word for word.
Wow, this is so weird. Like, literally, you guys were talking about that conversation in the car.
Yep.
Yeah, because I was talking about
Nino Kuni. Just said that.
I was talking about how that is a great way to do an overworld, right? Because a lot of people are like, no, you can't do like the big character model on the out of scale map nowadays. Like, no, you certainly can still do that. It worked in Dragon Quest. It worked in Nino Kuni. There's nothing wrong with doing that. And there is a positive to go in that direction as well when it comes to exploration and all this. It doesn't have to be 7 Rebirth. As much as I love 7 Rebirth, it does not need to be a 1-to-1 scale recreation of 9's world. They could certainly do something, first of all, a lot more budget appropriate by going something similar to 9, but they can also stay true to the original. They can elaborate on the original in a much greater way if they scope it correctly, right? Because if they try to fully recreate that world, they're going to spend all their resources doing that. But if they stay true to the original, they can take that world and they can elaborate on it in a major way, stay true to the original. And I agree, whimsy, 100%. Something similar in vibe to Ghibli.
I think 9 needs it, though. 9 is one of those games that without the levity, without the whimsy, it loses what makes it so special.
The contrast, right? It's about that contrast.
Yeah. It's able to tackle a lot of heavy themes, but balance it very well with having a little lighthearted moments that don't completely take you out of the heavy, but remind you that we're all a team here. We're all still, you know what I mean? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes to pacing, right? I mean, it's the contrast between it is important. You talk about Wind Waker, you talk about 9, and you talk about like whimsy in games. I wonder if that's something that you feel like was an aid to you in kind of getting attached to and helping process through some of those things. The fact that it was both relatable and serious at the same time in like an alternating way. I wonder what your thoughts are on just kind of what it was about that you specifically connected with that helped you in that very personal, challenging moment.
I think there's an expression that you can achieve more easily in a way at that time, especially with going with something a little bit more whimsical, cartoonish, whatever you want to call it. But I look back to 7 as well, 7 OG, and when they were in the more chibi style models, they were doing things that were very animated, right? You got Barrett jumping up and down and slamming his fists, and in 9, same way you got Steiner jumping up and down and slamming his fists. There's an animation to that I could really connect with at the time, where I felt like the hyper realistic stuff, especially, or what was trying to be hyper realistic at the time back in those days, you actually lost a little bit of that. You lost a little. It felt more stilted. It felt more rigid. So something like 9 and 7, even people get on 7 from being like, biceps that look like Lego blocks and all this kind of stuff. Like, yes, but I think they were actually able to achieve through that an animation and an expression that connected with us.
Yeah.
It was consistent as well, right? Yeah. So I think people look to 7 and they think of what they looked like in battle, the character models and all that kind of stuff. But really, 7 was not too much different from 9 when you are anywhere else but in battle and in CGI cutscenes,
I mean, I kind of want to talk about the color in itself. So for me as a kid, and especially like losing my dad so suddenly, I feel like I very much isolated. I was very confused. My grandparents at the time, they're great people, don't get me wrong, but they were not equipped to deal with a child going through a period of mourning. And for me as a kid, there's no linear way of mourning. Like, you have the 5 stages of grief, but it doesn't necessarily mean you go through the first 4, the denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then go straight to acceptance. Sometimes you go back through the other steps and they show up in different orders. And I experienced several years because, and I'll just touch on this. I'm not trying to make things too sad, but my aunt's husband actually ended up passing.
Wow.
In what, like, not even 3 years later. And it was really hard for me because he was kind of like my fatherly figure after my dad died, that's where Final Fantasy X came in to help me cope with other things. But if those games, 9 and 10 especially, had not been so light in a world of darkness, it kind of would have, if it had been as dark, in reality, I would have only been able to look at my world as darkness. Like, these games, as they dealt with heavy themes revolving around loss and death, but still having a brightness to them, gave me a lot of hope.
Yeah.
I mean, I spent hundreds of hours alone in my room.
Yeah.
And I was very sad. And these games, the characters in these games became my friends. And their worlds became the worlds that I wanted to live in, because while they were going through so much darkness, they still had this bit of hope and this bit of light, and it was how beautiful their world was, and the beautiful friendships that they had, and how, what's the word for it, how persistent they were throughout so much hardship. Especially Yuna in Final Fantasy X. Obviously, I relate to her a lot. She goes through several things in her life that anybody would probably throw in the towel for. And same thing for Vivi. He's 9 years old, facing his eventual death.
I think there's a reason these games, specifically Final Fantasy, like, they're hard to let go of.
Yeah.
There's a reason Final Fantasy series specifically is known for like a post-game depression, because it is so hard to finish these games and leave these worlds and leave these characters, especially.
I call it the emotional hangover.
It is like an emotional hangover. Like, you feel like you're losing family when you finish these games, because you spend so long with them and you connect with them so deeply. There's so many different archetypes of characters in Final Fantasy, and there's almost always going to be 1 or 2 or 3 that it's like that. This person is like me. Like, I'm connecting with this person in a major way, and it's hard to let go of them.
I didn't spend $700 on Princess Garnet back there for no reason. That's my girl.
Right.
And I think Final Fantasy X, since it was brought up, a lot of people talk about 9 being like the colorful, cartoony one, but 10 is no different in that that's the whole point, right? Spira is called Spira because it's the spiral of death. It's about that cyclical nature of it. But the setting of 10 is literal paradise.
Right.
Like that's the whole thing, is like you've got this tragic story ultimately in Final Fantasy X, but set in one of the most beautiful worlds in Final Fantasy, in my opinion.
The Southern Tropical Spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In my classes, we talk about mythology and all of these kind of formative stories, especially like creation stories that the world has passed on. And we have a definition of myth, and it really comes from Karen Armstrong, who wrote, she's kind of a religious anthropologist, philosopher, philosophy of religion sort of thing. And when she speaks of myth, she says, when we use the word myth, in some ways we speak of something that is true, whether or not it happened. When we speak of myth, we speak of something that may or may not have happened in one time, but in many ways it happens all the time. When I talk about Final Fantasy, I do talk about these as modern myths, reinterpretation of myths. And the thing that happens in a myth that whether it is a superhero movie, which I should write a thesis one day on, like, these are the modern myths of our day. We see ourselves in Captain America. Or whether it's Final Fantasy, these are stories that resonate so deeply with us on a human level. And to kind of transition a little bit into our Rebirth discussion, when you're dealing with these formative myths that people see their lives in the midst of those lives, our stories in the midst of those stories, if someone tampers with it in any way, it feels incredibly encroaching on meaning.
All right, everybody, it's that time of the episode for our mini game stretch break. So everybody, let's just get a little stretch. Just want to say thanks again to Droogle and Shoop for joining us for this episode. Viewer, listener, wherever you are, get a little stretch.
You guys probably couldn't hear that, but that was a massive crack over there.
I'm telling you, that we live for it.
Be kind to yourself. Just get up, move around a little bit.
I don't want to reveal my pit stains.
Hey, listen. Hey, it was an intense interview, everybody.
It was intense.
Let's see him.
So before we jump into our bingo wheel of vulnerability, you know that we got to hit that theme music. So 3, 2, 1. Thank you so much. Great job.
Honestly, that might have been the best one we've ever done. That was like a chorus. Maybe it's because there's 4 of us. That was like really good. Lovely.
That was great.
A good one.
It.
Drew and I being in the same room.
It's helpful.
Off time. Yeah, but still no.
Perfect.
Listen, you guys did great. So everybody, we have our bingo wheel of vulnerability. This is that time in the episode where we get to know each other a little bit better. Wade, talk a little bit about our question cards that we're going to be using today.
The question card that we're going to be using today comes from the Hero's Journal side quest deck. There's a journal. We've got a link in the comments here, and this is to help you live every life, every day, like it's a adventure. So
there we go.
We doing that?
So inside the bingo wheel of vulnerability, we have the numbers 1 through 50. Droogle and Shoop, we're going to let you guys guess your numbers first, and then Wade and I will guess the number.
Okay. We each get a number.
Yeah, you each get a number, 1 through 50.
Okay. I'm going to go with 33.
33.
Oh, I thought he was going to take my number.
No, I won't do that. I know what your number is.
He knows what my number is.
And your number is?
My number is 13.
13. Okay, 33, 13. Wade, what do you want this week?
I'm going to do number 1.
I was going to do number 1.
Oh, I'm number 1.
I'm going to do number 50
number
then. We'll bookends it.
Oh,
okay, so
bookends.
33, 13, 1, and 50. Okay, so Droogle, Shoop, I'm going to spin it, and you guys just tell me when to stop, and I'll grab a ball. Stop! Wow, really good. Okay.
The synchronicity.
All
What?
right, here we go. Here it comes. That number is, oh my gosh, 14. So close, Shoop. You were so close.
So close.
Number 14. So, listener, if you guessed 14, you win. Congratulations. Wade, let's get that 14th question going.
Okay,
for us.
got it right here. This is an interesting one.
Uh-oh,
okay,
I'm nervous.
So, how did you learn to make a paper airplane?
Oh, very interesting.
Like, when did you learn? Tell us the story of when you learned to make a paper airplane.
I never thought I'd be able to tell this story, but I have a story.
I think you have a story
What?
and I don't.
I have a
Go for
story. I wanted to make a kite. I was like 8, 9. I did this with my dad. I wanted to make a kite. And so obviously piece of paper, it's square. I cut off some edges to try and make it more diamond shape. And I cut a hole through it. And I tried to tie a piece of yarn through it. It didn't work. Didn't work. Anyway, that's when my dad was like, do you want to learn about aerodynamics?
Wow.
Hello, child.
I tried to make a kite, and he's like, all right, aerodynamics time. And he just showed me how to make a paper airplane. Obviously, the paper airplane wasn't great, but it went a couple feet. But yeah, I think I was like 8 or 9 or something like that. And it was all because I tried to make a kite, try to understand how kites flew.
That's
and
awesome.
Piece of paper with no wind does not work, just so you guys know.
So
fun.
nobody try it now.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think back here. I'm almost 100% positive that it was my dad.
Yeah.
That what my dad was really into model airplanes, like the ones where you
Okay.
like literally build them and they're like a decent size, and you have to like use like the shrink wrap and like the heat gun and like wrap it and use like the actual, like you're actually like modeling it to be used with like a controller and
Whoa.
everything. Like it's got what they
Okay.
call like servos or something like that, where you can control the rudders. Like he would do
Yeah.
the whole thing. So he was really into like the aerodynamics and all that of making it all work. So of course my dad doesn't just teach you how to do like a normal paper airplane. It's not like just like the, hey, fold it 3 times, go. It's like no, you got to make a little point here and a point there. And, you know, of course, it's all competition on how far it flies.
Yeah.
So that's the memory I do have. And I bet you that's probably the first time as well, is thanks to my very, very clever dad. He's very, very creative. He's
There
very
you
good
go.
with his hands.
Shout out.
So thank you, Dad.
Okay. I'll go. I remember I was in, I think it was first grade, and there was a paper airplane throwing competition. And I remember they said, so take a sheet of paper, design it however you want, and all this stuff. And they would give us like crayons. And so I made, like, I didn't know how to make a paper airplane, but I knew that you had to fold it somehow. So I just drew all kinds of things. I'm pretty sure I drew a Mario on this sheet of paper. And then I tried to turn it into an airplane, and Mario did not get to the princess. Mario like tanked immediately. So I went home afterwards, and I had this like sheet of paper, and I went to my dad, and I was like, do you know how to make a paper airplane, because this was awful? And he was like, well, no son of mine's going to lose in a paper airplane contest. So he showed me how to, and he was like, no, if you want it to go far, then you have to tip the wings up like this. He was like a professional paper airplane maker or whatever. It was pretty impressive. So anyway, props to Dad.
I think our dads would have been friends.
Undoubtedly.
I feel like that. I love that the paper airplane is like it's such a dad thing.
Apparently a dad thing. Right?
It's
Okay,
definitely
when
a
is
dad thing.
Marlene going to learn how to make a paper airplane?
Oh, great question.
Part 3. That's the big question. Evan, what about you?
Yeah, same thing for me. My dad is an engineer, so it was very much this is how we're going to do it. Here are the options, and then it was a process improvement lesson of experimentation and testing. We even made little rudders so that it would like spin in a circle, and we learned all about aerodynamics.
That's amazing.
All of
Why
those
do
things.
I feel like in your household, like when it comes to having an engineer for a father, potty training and paper airplane making kind of just go hand in hand? Like if you want to go to kindergarten, you got to know how to do these 2 things.
These are the things.
One
of them is fluid dynamics.
You're going to be ready. Yeah. And he taught me I was a very small child, not very strong. He also taught me how to fight. And what he said was, just run away. You're fast. He said, under no circumstances should you ever try and engage anyone in combat. You are to play to your strengths and flee. So
this is only if you can't get away. This is why it's called self-defense. When you can't get away.
No, he said, don't even try. You're wasting time to try. Just run. You're very fast. You can escape.
I love it.
So it was a good lesson to learn. So, listener, I hope that you've enjoyed your stretch break. Everybody, let's get another stretch in here. Droogle, Shoop, thank you for sharing about your paper airplanes experience. And, leave it in the comments of the Discord. What was your first experience learning how to make a paper airplane, or a notable paper airplane story that you want to share? Just connect with some people and connect maybe with your past a little bit. So, speaking of past, let's talk about how our past informed our opinions on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. What a transition. See you back in the episode, everybody.
All right, so as we transition over to the idea of rebirth and our take on that, I think that so often when we're thinking about myths and all this stuff, we do get protective, especially of the stories that have helped make us and in some ways remake us in the midst of our lives. So, there's a lot of opinions about remake, Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth. And, it's because people have this deep love and respect and meaning from the original, and certainly the same with the possibility of an FF9 remake. What kind of cautions, thoughts do you have regarding remake? How do you approach it, especially in light of some of the changes perhaps that they have made in remake? Did you meet that with caution and all that kind of stuff? Go for it.
It's tough because I think I'm different than a lot of the Final Fantasy VII fan base. I think it's just that we're very split on this, right? And from the moment that I played 7 and I loved 7 so much, it really wasn't that long after the original release that people were already talking about a remake. I remember people talking about a remake of Final Fantasy VII in like the early 2000s, like that early on. People were talking about it. And of course, that sort of became a true possibility for a lot of people in 2005-ish, I want to say, when the Final Fantasy VII tech demo was released with PS3. And I remember when that first was shown off, people thought it was a real thing. And then, of course, it came out that it was just a tech demo. But that was really the moment where it's like, oh my God, now I really want a Final Fantasy VII remake. But me personally, at the time, I was like, as much as I would love this, like, how do you do this and not upset half the fan base? How do you do this with being new and original, but also paying homage to the original? Of course, it wasn't until 10 years later in 2015 that they truly announced Final Fantasy VII Remake. And by that point, it was even more dangerous, in my opinion. You had gone almost 20 years at this point, people clamoring for a remake, fawning over the original, loving it so much, and in some ways not liking the compilation of Final Fantasy VII since. Some people didn't like Crisis Core. A lot of people didn't like Dirge of Cerberus. It was the original was this untouchable thing. And it's like, how do you do that? Like, and then they announce that it's not going to be one part, that it's going to be 3 parts.
Yeah.
And the fan base explodes, right? It's like, what are they doing? They're nickel and diming us. I think from the moment that information came out, a lot of people just expected the worst. They assumed that it was going to be terrible. It'll never match the original. There's no way they can do this right. And I think there was a sort of confirmation bias that came from that with its eventual release. I will admit, me personally, when I heard that it was going to be 3 parts, like almost everybody, I think I was wary. I was like, okay, just Midgar for the first game? How? Like, it's 6 hours in the original. How do you take a 6-hour chunk of game and make it into a 40-hour RPG? But I'd say it probably only took a few weeks before I could really sit on. And I was like, okay, well, hold on a sec. I think this comes from my love of the gaming industry as a whole and really inspecting game development. And I think understanding game development a little bit better than some people do. In that just I'm so invested in investigating studios and what they're working on and the process of it, right? When you really think about what they are doing with Final Fantasy VII Remake, Rebirth, and Part 3, and you understand what has changed since 1997 and game development since 1997, you look at that original and you understand that Midgar is a collection of dozens of pre-rendered backgrounds. When you go from one location to the next, you are skipping a major chunk of travel in between. You're literally, I always talk about the train graveyard, and I think we've even talked about this before. The train graveyard in the original game is 2 screens.
2 screens.
It is literally 2 pre-rendered screens. You can run through it in 5 minutes. If you don't have encounters on, you can run through it in 1 minute.
Yeah.
It is literally that short. Would people have been okay with going through the train graveyard in 5 minutes today? I think a lot of people would say they would be, but they would not have been.
Probably not.
They would not have been. They can say that
like,
all they
what
want.
was that? Why was that in there? Yeah.
Or they would say they could have given us more.
Was too much time spent in the train graveyard? I think that's a conversation that we can have. Did it mess up the pacing? Did it take away some of the sense of urgency racing towards the Sector 7 tower or the Sector 7 plate collapse? Yeah, okay, we can talk about that. I'll talk about the pacing, the sense of urgency that it might have removed. But I do not think people would have been okay with that chunk of the game just being a run through moment. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind is they are not just doing a 1-to-1 pre-rendered background, the pre-rendered background remake. This is a 1-to-1 scale of the world. They are recreating this story. And they're also trying to give us a lot of what our nostalgia glasses don't remember. And I replayed Final Fantasy VII OG before and after remake. And especially when you play it again after remake, you realize who were Jesse, who were Biggs, who were Wedge.
Yeah.
They're almost nobody. Like they really have almost no character development. There's really no connection to be had with those characters. And I mean, I'm speaking for myself here, but I know in remake, I loved all three of them, especially Jesse. And I couldn't believe how much the character they added to that. And then they even capitalized on it further in Rebirth, as we might discuss, with emotional gut punch when it comes to the loss of those three characters. I don't think by today's standards, I don't think we would have been okay with any of that pacing in the original coming through in remake.
A question about just the nature of imagination when it comes to remakes and that length of time. Because Shoop, you mentioned the game Journey was one of your favorite games. And that's one of the prominent games that comes to mind for me when it comes to just letting you use your imagination and expression for what characters mean, especially as you're being led by another character and different things like that. It really is an interesting experience. If you haven't ever played the game, maybe Shoop, you can describe a little bit about what you like about that game and kind of what I'm talking about. Since you mentioned it being one of your favorites, but as you've grown up, like we did insert a lot of imagination into the gaps of some of these things from our past. And so now you can't get away with that as much in some of these big AAA games. They have to really show and allow you to experience it because we just had these little gaps and mysteries that we were more okay with. Shoop, what do you think about that when it comes to remake, and what do you think that role of imagination has in these games, especially as it comes to these kind of revisiting of these things that have meant so much to us in the past?
So I think, especially when it comes to remake and Rebirth, obviously the people who are making these games are giving you what they feel they wanted to be able to give you in 1997, that they just did not have the hardware to do so. So when we grow up when we start with a video game when we're young, and it's very limited, so you fill in the gaps in your own, right? Whatever it is that is canon to you and to your imagination. When somebody who makes the games tries to fill in those gaps themselves with much more broader experience and much more broader ideas that they wanted to do years ago, and then they hand it to you, and then you've already got your own headcanon, not everybody's gonna be happy, like what Drew was saying.
Right.
I guess I'll touch on like what the remake of 9 would be. There are certain things in 9, for example, that I feel like you can't leave out if you remake it. There are certain moments in 9 that I also feel like are kind of like blazed over. Like, well, hold on, shouldn't be this be a little bit more important? I've already cooked up something on my head that would make this scene better. Why didn't they?
Sure.
You know? And I think, and well, like what Drew was saying about Jesse and Biggs and Wedge, nobody gave two about them until the remake because they weren't anybody, and they were given story. They were given real story. Other than just, well, we're part of Avalanche.
Bye.
Well, and
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
They're in the first 5 hours of the game, right? And I mean, this is a real story for me. I shared it on stream one time, but like in the original game in 1997, I played through it, and I've played through Final Fantasy VII original every year since I got it at 13 years old, right? And so when I first met Jessie, and every year after that, when I would play through the Midgar section,
I know exactly what you're going to say right now.
I thought that her hair was a cowboy hat, and I thought it was a cowboy. I
You
thought
thought it was a boy,
dude.
right?
I thought it was a dude, a cowboy.
I thought Jesse was a boy too.
And right?
Yep.
Because like as great as the graphics were, they
Yep.
still were not great, right? And so I'm like looking at that, I'm like, that's really funny. Why'd they make him a cowboy? Because I knew a real Jesse who was a guy in my life. And it was just funny. And so
Howdy, partner, the plate's gonna fall.
The plate, yeehaw. It's a Mako rodeo.
I couldn't tell if Aerith was wearing pants. I thought for the longest time that Aerith was wearing pants.
I thought it was a little pantsuit, like a little Hillary Clinton
pantsuit too.
get up or something. Like okay, power suit
I
Aerith.
thought she was wearing the little Jenko jeans, but they were pink.
And ironically,
exactly.
Ironically, I don't know if you've seen this, but Nomura was interviewed this week about, I would say, some of this directly, and he talked about nostalgia, and he talked about people's headcanons and their memories of these games, and how it's hard to make something today and sort of reconcile people's memories with what the reality is, because I can tell you, and I do not want to get in the shipping wars, I'll preface that, but I will say, I think a lot of people, they look back on the original, and first off, I think a lot of people think that Tifa and Aerith are like in competition with each other.
But
Like
they're
that,
not.
they're not. You go back and play that game. There's only one moment in the entire game that I can really remember where there was any sort of tension, and it was when they're in the cells of Shinra headquarters, and and Tifa's like, "Oh, I see," about like the date thing. That's like the one moment where I feel like she perked up, like, "Ooh, what's going on here?" Otherwise, no, not at all. And I love that in Remake and Rebirth, they completely took that and spun it, and people are upset about it in some way now for some reason, but they're like girl power all the way. Best friends, supporting each other, having each other's backs. Aerith never had a girlfriend before, like a girlfriend in that way, right? Like a friend who's a girl would like to pal around with. And Tifa didn't either, exactly. So now it's like these two are finding each other and are finding a friend that they've never had before. And I think it's beautiful. I love it about Remake and Rebirth, the relationship that these two have. But there's a lot about the original that I don't think people, unless they replay it now, I don't think they have the right memory of it. And I don't blame them either. Like these games in our heads, like I know specifically with like Shadow of the Colossus, let's say, for example, to jump to a completely different game, but something that released in PS2 era. So a remake of it is not that far in a way different, right? But when you play the remake of Shadow of the Colossus, if you haven't played the original in a long time, you might be like, yeah, this is kind of what it always looked like, right? Like, yeah, this is, but then you go back and you play the original and you're like,
it's like, oh, no, it wasn't.
No, it was not. This is not what it was.
My biggest thing with the whole like Tifa era thing, I will say, is like, you can, and we talk about this all the time being online in general, is that tone through text is non-existent. Like you can say something.
That's a good point.
Yeah, you can say something in a written form, and it can come off completely different if there is no if there's no tone to it.
Yeah.
So people are reading. There was no voice acting in '97. People are reading dialogue and they're interpreting it in the tone that they hear in their head. And now with Remake, we get to hear the tone of people's voices. We get to hear their confidence. We get to hear their doubts. We get to hear their joy. We get to hear their fear through their tone.
That especially applies to Red 13, right? Because I've seen a lot of people upset about this, that Red 13's voice changes once you read Cosmo Canyon. I will say personally, I always kind of felt that, right? I feel like they did a pretty good job in the original of there being a change in Red 13 in the way he speaks textually when you reach Cosmo Canyon. But I think a lot of people didn't really expect that. So when it happens in Rebirth, people were like seemingly dismayed that like his gruff, cool voice went away. But I was like, yes, they did it. Like they actually did what I always thought was the case. Like he's just a young pup almost in a way. So when his voice changes, that's something they could only do now because of the voice acting. And that's a perfect example like that. You know, we read these games back then, we make up our own voices in our heads, which is great. It's a positive in some ways of those old games, but it also allows an opportunity for these new games to elaborate on that or to kind of change it and kind of twist it in a way we didn't expect.
I think another big thing to note, and I've seen this a lot in Final Fantasy online spaces, especially 7 online spaces. I've seen a lot of people say that Tifa is very confident, and she's not. She has a lot of self-doubt and a lot of insecurity, and that's not knocking her at all. Hello, that's a very human trait. And people will say, well, they just they can't stand Aerith because of like she's too much. And I'm like, but hold on, didn't you just say like Tifa's confident? I'm like, did you even like Drew does this too? Like, did you even play the game? Like Aerith has
I get it though.
Yeah, she has a lot of confidence in what she says and how she says it. And Tifa sometimes will self-guess herself. But like when it's in written format, if in the original, you can read it in your head as like this is a confident statement, even if it might not be. Or Aerith might come off as a lot more meeker or shy when you're reading it, but it's not.
This came out in the interview this week, and I think that's great that you recognize that because it's something that Nomura called it memory distortion in the interview recently, and it's exactly what it is we remember these games, and especially now when we look at them visually, it further distorts our memory because from a visual standpoint, you would expect Tifa to be confident, sure of herself one.
Fighting
You
with
would look at
fists.
Aerith and expect her to be the airy, flighty, angelic,
Mm.
pixie fairy girl that is the archetyped. But the truth is that Tifa's very unsure of herself. She has a really hard time speaking up. She's a people pleaser. Whereas Aerith is the one who is going to speak up and be sassy and spunky and put Cloud in his place. And that's
make
it's the
people
exact
uncomfortable.
opposite. And it was intentional too, right?
Yeah.
Because when Nomura was designing Aerith, the whole point of her character design was not to be, oh, she's wearing pink because Zach liked pink. No, retcon. The true intention of Aerith when she was designed was to be a foil for Cloud. It was to be the contrast of Cloud. Tifa wasn't even supposed to exist.
Right.
Tifa was pulled away from Aerith and created as a character later on to be dual heroines. That's like completely changes your perspective when you look at it that way. And I think it's an amazing thing they did. I love that they did that. First off, it creates a beautiful love triangle, and love is this really complex thing. And I wish people would look at it that way, that you can love more than one person. But also it allowed for you have these two women that play off of Cloud in different ways and are both very important to him in different ways and help him in very different ways.
Aerith reminds me of like the parent who, rather than like getting their kids' feet wet, like trying to teach them how to swim, will just push them in the water. And Tifa is a lot more nurturing, and she'll like baby step you into like toes first, or put on your life vest, like be careful. And Aerith's like, bye, go swim.
There's
like,
a reason Tifa is very maternal.
She's very maternal.
Right.
They both have incredible qualities that balance out what helps Cloud come out of whatever shell that he has become. But it's hard to, when it comes to the Final Fantasy VII version of that, it's hard to see that when typically, no offense, Final Fantasy VII fans, but when you're looking at certain characters through these rose-colored glasses based on which one you prefer, Tifa or Aerith. It doesn't have to be Tifa or Aerith. It can be both. And the remake, and especially Rebirth, gives us both.
This is something that does come up in the interview that Drew, you've mentioned a couple of times now. It's kind of an interesting. I don't really want to call it a cop out because I don't feel like that's what it is. But I know a lot of people are saying this is. But it's this idea at the end of Rebirth when Sephiroth is guiding Cloud through all of these myriad worlds. Nomura says something to the extent of, this is a nod to all of those headcanons, but also all the possibilities. All of them do exist. But what I love is that they seem to be doing is they're saying, yeah, in our imagination, all of these things do kind of exist, but we're telling this one particular story, and that's definitely going to ruffle some feathers in part 3, I think. And that's
it's sort of like
danger.
A please everybody type comment, right? It's like, hey, the Final Fantasy VII of your dreams exists. It's out there somewhere.
Sure.
It's nice. It's a nice, it's a nice idea. I guess
it's the idea of like, does the original exist in this continuity, and therefore, for those that say, yeah, this is a sequel to that, well, okay, that's fair. For those that are like, this is a remake of that, sure, fine. And it's like, the way that you make sense of all of this matters. Now, when it comes to, I think that there can be discussions of authorial intent, the creator's design and intention behind a story, like what were they intending, that no level of subjective observation is really going to, you can't overtake that. But what we see on screen or in game or whatever, that's what we do have to take. There's a concept, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts on some specifics in Rebirth. There's a concept in whether you're viewing something or reading something that we call overreading, and it's the idea that you are reading into something a little too much, right? You're projecting your own biases, prejudices, preferences, whatever it is, into a text. And so I'm the master of overreading because as a religious studies guy, I'm looking through the lens of religious studies and myth into everything. Even if it doesn't exist, I'm like, oh, that's neat. And, somebody would say, a cigar is just a cigar, Wade. It's fine. I'm like, but let's go to the deeper meaning, right? I've got my whiteboard and all the strands. But when it comes to Rebirth, I think that there's so much ambiguity to what could happen, certainly with Remake, that they're trying to invite and emulate for a new day that level of imagination, because you don't have the same opportunity for imagination and creativity in hyper realistic spaces that you did back in the day. I would always think of what would Barrett and Red talk about as they went from Midgar to Calm, because I was always Cloud, Tifa, Aerith on my way to Calm. What would that other party think about? And now they're kind of telling us when they split up, these are the things they talk about and stuff. So they're still giving us this opportunity to imagine in between these installments. When it comes to the ambiguities of Rebirth and some of the big mysteries, particularly, what made you most curious and what really worked for you in Rebirth?
I think it's incredibly intentional what they're doing in so many different facets of Rebirth. I think that they know what gets people talking. I think that they know, especially with it being a multi-part series, that having a level of ambiguity is going to allow for those 2 to 3 to 4 years in between games to be filled with theory crafting and all this. I love it personally. I love that I'm thinking about this game every day since Rebirth, wondering what they're going to do next. Just even the littlest things, like the very end where Cloud and Aerith have their last conversation in the church, and based on your affection level, how that can be different, right? And it's such a subtle change, right? But it's the way, Aerith talks to him about another date, and Cloud's very subtle difference in response of, yeah, why not? Versus, I'm trying to draw the other quote in mind, but it was more like, yeah,
Next
of course, next time. Yeah. And with like a smile on his face, two very different reactions, right? That allow the fan base to go crazy over, what did it mean? Like, what is he saying here? But of course, like the overarching mysteries, I say the big one. Do we want to talk about Aerith's death?
Everything. Yes, we will talk.
Yeah.
This is full spoilers.
I think it's genius what they did. Honestly,
Okay.
I think it's incredibly genius. We've been talking about it for years, ever since Remake was announced, how they're going to handle Aerith's death.
Okay.
And I knew they were never going to do it 1-to-1. I was like, from the moment there's no way. It's either going to be that they change it entirely or they give a nugget of hope. They're going to do something, right? But what they did was actually beyond my imagination, because they kind of did the cake and eat it too type moment where it's like they still did it. She's still dead, right? But they completely changed the perspective of it by putting us in Cloud's head like never before. And I would argue that the end of Rebirth is so much more tragic than the original game ever was. And
I agree.
I think people are so upset that they didn't show the burial. And yeah, it's a tough pill to swallow, right? To not give us that closure at the end of Rebirth. We just witnessed this death, or did we? And then you're not going to give us any closure with a burial, but it's so intentional, in my head at least. It's so intentional that they did that. Because from the moment he goes to her, right after she died, and she opens her eyes and he says her name, like Aerith, and he seems so positive. Flash away. We're looking at the lake, where anybody who is a diehard Final Fantasy VII fan would know this is where they buried her, but we're not seeing it. Cloud is staring out with no emotion whatsoever. Everybody else seems to be completely sullen and in pieces, but Cloud's just staring out. And I thought it was such an effective moment, and eerie, and it made me so uncomfortable when he turns to her and sees her shrouded in sort of a shadow. And there's like this eerie version of the live stream music that plays as he's looking at her. And especially when they're leaving and Tifa is looking at him and sees him look to nobody that is there, smiles, and then walks away. I thought that was chilling, honestly. The way that Tifa is the only one that noticed it. Like, there's something very wrong.
I thought
with
it was
Cloud
broken before.
right now.
Now he's really messed up.
And it allows them an amazing opportunity here, because anybody that's played the original game knows how important Tifa is to Cloud and to his reconstruction. Rebirth was Aerith's game. It was made to be Aerith's game, and it deserved to be. They did it. They did it well. Tifa's going to have her moment. And it's going to be huge in the next game, but it's going to be so much more layered than it was in the original, because it's not just about helping Cloud realize who he is. It's about revealing the truth to him, having him accept it, realize that you've failed, but hey, also you're a hero at the same time. Like there's so many layers to Cloud, right? He doesn't even know what he did for Tifa all those years ago. He doesn't remember that. Right now, he doesn't even, I think, realize that Aerith is dead. I don't think he's processed what has happened. So imagine that moment in part 3, if they do it, where Tifa is bringing him through the life stream to these moments from the past, the tower, Nibelheim. But now also imagine in that scene where there's 3 different places you can go to, there's an extra one now, one that wasn't there before. And it's the lake. And you have to see that moment and you have to play it. Imagine if you control Cloud walking into the water with Aerith in his arms. Imagine that you have to be the one that does it. Imagine how powerful that could be. Everybody's so upset that it was removed, but you're not thinking about that this is 3 parts. You're not thinking about how powerful that moment could be if you are in control of it. If you are in Cloud's headspace in that moment when he has to accept what has happened. They have an opportunity to do something so much better than the original in my mind, but they have to do it. So
yeah. Shoop, you said that you agreed that it was more tragic. What comes to mind for you around that idea that the way that they've chosen to tell the story is more tragic? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I've already spoken about some of my personal trauma, but like it's very realistic. And for anyone who's ever been through sudden trauma, I think can relate to denial is not just like oh God, I can't believe they're gone. It really, especially in a sudden traumatic moment like that, it's very realistic to what it feels like, that it is not real. Absolute denial. And I think seeing Cloud, especially like, and something, I saw this on Twitter ages ago, and I think it popped up recently because people are yelling about Tifa Aerith shipping. But that, if you notice, is it's the Genova life clinger fight right after Aerith dies, which Drew, y'all need to see him crying through that. It was so hard. Anybody who ever tries to get through that fight without tears, I think, is a psychopath. But Cloud doesn't have his limit break. Everybody else in the party does. Completely full. Their limit break is completely full because they were experiencing rage. They didn't really hit the whole denial wall. They might have been like, oh no, anyway. But they were angry. They went straight into rage. He was straight into the fight with everybody with their limit break except for Cloud. His bar is completely empty. And we see, you know, obviously you're fighting with your party, but then also when you're fighting Sephiroth, Aerith comes in and joins him. And I really feel like internally that's a big part of him doing whatever his subconscious can do to keep her in this with him. Not just mentally and not just emotionally, not in my heart, but like here, whatever he can cook up physically to keep her here with him. And I mean, God, it really tore me up. I'm trying not to cry, but it tore me up when there was that moment, that sliver of hope, not just for Cloud, but for the person playing the game and anyone watching the game. Because again, I was watching this. I was moderating for Drew when he played it on release. And watching that sliver of hope and thinking, oh, he might have actually saved her. Like, he might be changing the timeline or whatever. And then that just gets ripped away from you. That is what sudden trauma feels like.
Yeah.
When you feel this isn't real, but it's ripped away from you so quickly, and then there is nothing you can do to stop it. You don't just say, okay, that happened, you know?
But there's enough ambiguity there, right?
There is,
to go with what you're
make
saying.
You question yourself, but that is what trauma is. That is what sudden trauma is. You start questioning everything. Like, this doesn't make sense. How could this happen? This isn't right. The fallacies that go on in your head of right and wrong. Like, and to be able to really see it, I don't care. I'm sorry to anybody who was like, that ending was trash. If you have not experienced your own sudden trauma, I don't want to hear it. I've seen games, several games, try to depict what sudden trauma feels like. I think that they did it so well, giving us Cloud's perspective to what sudden trauma
At the same time, though, like, I want to put myself in the headspace of those that don't like the ending. And I do get it, because there is certainly an unsatisfying impact to that, right?
It would have been just as unsatisfying if you had it as the exact same scene as the original. And you know darn well that if they had done exactly what they did in 1997, little stabby, oh no, Anyway, let's go bury her. People would have been like, they could have done so much more.
I agree with that, but people, they don't know that until they see it, right? So people that wanted a 1-to-1, or at least wanted closure in some sense. Like, I get it, because in their head that doesn't matter, that given that they might have been unsatisfied anyway. The fact is they weren't given it. And that's all they care about. That it wasn't 1-to-1 and they weren't given it. But also, going back to what you were saying, Noctis, it's very intentional, right? Because there's enough there so clearly that they want us to wonder if the Aerith we're seeing at the end is entirely in his subconscious. Is it Aerith from the live stream? Is it Aerith from another reality? Is it Genova? Like, there's so many possibilities on who that Aerith could be. I think we have to wait till part 3 to see it all reconciled. And it could be that multiple of those are true at the same time in some sense. And I would argue myself that the Aerith that we see at the very end of 7 OG coming from the live stream, like, how would it really be that much different really in the end anyway? Like, whether it's multiple realities or the live stream, or multiple realities represents the live stream. Right? Like, the live stream, that's what it could be. The live stream could be everything all at once, death, life, rebirth, all at once, right? So there's no reason that they couldn't reconcile it in the final game to explain that live stream is everything.
Well, wait, I wonder, as we talk about this, if it's important to distinguish some of the storytelling aspects and how we form our opinions, because we've talked in other episodes about really understanding how we feel about something, and then you talk about this with your students a lot. Let's understand that we feel this way about it. Now let's try and break it down. And I think it's probably fair to say that the story at the end of Rebirth is unresolved, right? It is part 2 of a 3-part thing. It is unresolved. Now, agreeing that it's unresolved, and because it's unresolved, that feels unsatisfying, or it's unresolved and then now I'm satisfied with the hope that they're going to be able to tie it up, it creates a pathway to really try and understand why it is that we either liked or didn't like it, and whether we feel like it accomplished its goals as a stepping stone. And we won't know for sure until the 3rd game, but I know that you and your students talk about that frequently, Wade.
Yeah, we do. I think that for most of us, especially today in online discourse and in personal lives, we do gravitate towards certainty rather than mystery. We do this in our religions, our politics, and we do this with our Final Fantasy as well. And so, and it creates the tribes with which we associate. So I am certain that this happens. And so whenever they're not giving us those clear answers, or a lack of closure because it's part 2 of 3, then we try to wrestle some certainty from it. And sometimes that certainty creates some, or lack of certainty creates some cognitive dissonance that makes us say, I don't like this anymore. This isn't the story that I wanted. And especially, final thing, we kind of talked about this earlier, but like, when we have a story that has meant so much to so many people, this helped me get through this part of my life. It was a coming of age sort of moment for me as I played through this game in 97, or when I discovered it, like, these people were in my life. To play with that and not have the same emotional payoff feels like anathema to us. It feels like you have done something vilely offensive to me at this point. And I think that that's kind of the point, weirdly. And, it strikes me, we all have our impression and interpretation of the original FF7 and that moment, climactic moment with Aerith. So are they just going to replay that nostalgia bait in some ways, or are they helping us relive it again? One thing that occurred to me in y'all's comments was this idea of Aerith continuing in Cloud's mind beyond her death. At the end of Advent Children, Sephiroth, before he's vanquished, says, "I will never be a memory," right? And it strikes me that in this retelling, in some ways, Aerith is giving the counter to that, saying, I will never be. I will never just be a memory to you, but I will be with you in this way. Because it almost seemed with Advent Children that it's just this constant cycle of struggle and suffering. And here we have the perfect foil to that but there's also hope, and that's not going to leave you as well. I wonder, with your experience of Rebirth and playing it and watching it, the moments of struggle, the moments of hope, and the tension there with you, what are the standout moments of the game that you're like, this is an amazing way of telling this story that's going to stick with me about struggle and hope? Where did you see those two things in Rebirth?
Can I go first?
Yeah,
Sure,
please.
go ahead. Yeah.
Because it's the part that ruined me emotionally,
Okay.
but gave me that hope. And it was during the trials, and it was during Aerith's trial. And
What
it
was it
was
about
her.
that trial? Yeah.
Oh my God. Okay, so first of all, for anyone, I'm sure most people consuming this content have played Rebirth. So for anyone who hasn't, basically Aerith goes through this trial of her mother's death. And Ifalna is very sickly, but her trial starts with hope. It's these bright lights and flowers lighting up as they're on the train, and Ifalna is telling Aerith that we're gonna go on a trip together and giving Aerith hope. And then when the train stations and Ifalna is basically dying on the ground at the train station, and little Aerith is, basically sent to try and go find help. And she's going through the streets and trying to find anybody that will help her. And most of the people that she walks up to on the street heckle her and treat her like crap.
Right.
And one person finds her and says, "Do you need help?" And it's so sad watching Aerith, little baby Aerith. I'm gonna get all emotional, but like little baby Aerith trying to go through the street saying, "Does anybody have a doctor? Is there a doctor?"
Yeah.
And it's sad, we don't really get that drawn out in the original Final Fantasy VII, and to make that bigger was, I think, much needed. First of all, so we can better understand Aerith's background.
And
But
boy, doesn't that reemphasize just that theme of loss and grief? So
and
you
watching
don't
why
get
she
the
had to grow up so quickly too.
right. You don't get the water altar burial in this game. You don't get the full sequence, but you still capture that same theme of grief and loss, and yet the one person of peace and hope that comes into that moment of grief and loss. I think that that's a beautiful way of telling it without spoiling this other part that they wanted to make more of a mystery. I think that's cool.
Yeah. They gave her one little glimmer of hope, and it was just the one person on the street who was like, "What can I do to
Yeah.
help you?" And Ifalna tells her, "Take Aerith. You have to
Yeah.
protect Aerith." And it's that Aerith still had one person, complete stranger at this point, obviously, who later became her adoptive mother, but complete stranger who was willing to give Aerith a chance.
And Drew, I want to hear yours in a second, but you've just made me think about something for part 3. I wonder if we're going to get the full recounting of what happened at the altar to Elmira, because we don't really get that. You can go back to the house and there's a bit of a conversation, but they've
But there's
built
no
up
one there,
Elmira,
like, going
right?
to tell Elmira what actually happened
And
to Aerith.
grieving and all of
Yeah.
that stuff, and like Marlene,
'Cause she
even
was a
when
mother
she
too.
finds out, right? And so I think, wow, that's going to be an amazingly powerful and potent moment.
You're gonna
Just
have
another
to.
example of grief and loss.
Yeah, I feel like I think it would be incredible if they put that in there, because it's one of the most, I think, difficult loss and grief stories that you can really portray, is a parent
Right.
having to lose their child. Like, that is, that's probably one of the most painful things you can go through.
Yeah.
And Elmira that was her daughter. Aerith was her daughter at the end of the day. Yes, she was Ifalna's biological child, and Aerith had her young childhood with her, but at the end of the day, Elmira raised that girl and protected that girl until the very end.
Well, in the same way Barrett's doing with Marlene, right? And that's
Exactly.
why when he hears Elmira say, "Well, she's not my daughter," it kind of pans to Barrett in Remake, and he kind of goes, And we discover, if you're playing through this for the first time, you're realizing, Barrett is not Marlene's birth father, right? And so I wonder what their dynamic would be. And I wonder if you can almost see Barrett breaking the news to Elmira and then to his own daughter. Just to see that sort of conveyance of loss. I'm curious about it.
I'm wondering if Drew is actually going to talk about Barrett more as far as the Dine goes and what they built off of that.
Yeah.
From
Drew, what moments stood out for you, and what are your thoughts?
I mean, all of the trials, not just Aerith's, were
Yeah.
brutal in my opinion. And I've actually seen some opinions that they were actually too much. I've seen some people think that they
Reds
were
was really hard.
really heavy,
Rez
but
is brutal.
I
Yeah.
think in particular Aerith's I think was by far the heaviest. They really make you live in that moment to have you actually walk Aerith around searching for help, having people reject her, throw her to the ground,
Right.
like having her have to walk back as well, crying, saying I couldn't help. Like that was a lot. They put a lot on the player there in that moment, and it was very intentional. And I go back to my point here that this is Aerith's game. In my opinion, this is 100% Aerith's game. And I think what they're really trying to portray here, and I think immediately after that in Temple of the Ancients and the conversation that follows, what we're supposed to look at and think here is how the heck did this girl turn out the way she did? Like she's a miracle. She's an absolute miracle that she went through everything she went through and is still the glue that holds this team together because she is. She 100% is. And nobody says it in the game, but they all know it. They all know that Aerith is the reason that they are together. They're the reason that they're held together. They all look at her that way. You can see it. You can honestly see it throughout the game, how important she is to that. And that's why her death, I think, weighs on the whole party the way it does, because of how meaningful she is to all of them in the short time that she's been with them.
She was the only one that Red would talk to in his real voice. Excuse me, Nana.
Before, at the very beginning, I thought it was a nice touch too, because they understand each other in a way that I think a lot of people didn't in that moment because of the live stream connection that they had. So I love that they were able to elaborate on her meaning to the party throughout the game. And also, I think a moment that was really powerful for me was in the Gold Saucer when she sings Promises to Keep, which there's a lot of interpretations to that song. It seems like the writer is saying that really is about everybody that she has encountered through her life, but especially in the story that we are witnessing about how important all these party members are, because she didn't have this before. She never had this. And it goes back to Remake as well, when you're in the train graveyard and her trauma is being left alone in that scene. All these boys and girls playing hide and seek, and she felt alone in that moment. And Cloud finds her. Tifa finds her, actually. I think we're kind of following up with that in Rebirth about her fear of being alone, and this journey that she goes on, finally being able to leave Midgar and see the world, and a world that she didn't expect. Right when she sees it for the first time, she's blown away. Like, oh my god, it has so much life. Like, I wasn't expecting this. She was fearful of the world prior to that. When you first leave Midgar, she says, "The steel sky, I miss it." And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think one of them being that it shielded her from seeing the life stream and the souls going up into the atmosphere. But I think it also was a fear of what was out there, a fear of the unknown. And this game is Aerith's game because it allows her to it's almost like a bucket list for her. This game, throughout the whole
really
thing,
is,
it feels there's an ominous tone into the game, in my opinion. It's again, sort of like a Final Fantasy 9 thing, where it's contrasted with a very light, joyful journey, right? Like they go through theme parks almost. Whether it be the cruise ship or Gold Saucer, or like, it's supposed to contrast though with what the eventuality is of her story. Anybody who knows the story knows where it's heading, and she knows where it's heading. You know that she does. You can tell that she knows her fate, but she powers through all of it. And I think that song is sort of almost like a goodbye in a way. But it also, I think what really hit me in that moment that I wasn't expecting was when it panned to the audience and Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge were there. And it kind of connected it all for me.
Wasn't that your first tear shed?
That was my first time I think I cried in the game. That hit me really hard for some reason. I think partially because it was confirmation that they're gone. That we had to accept it in that moment, that yes, they are truly gone. But it also was this connective tissue, right, of like what the live stream is and how nobody's ever truly gone. And a major theme throughout the game and the series, I would argue. So that really connected with me.
This is I'm so glad you brought that up. And there's been so many things that you've mentioned about Aerith's confidence and about this sequence with Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge in the theater. I think one critique that I've heard, particularly of that scene, is did Aerith really know Jesse Biggs and Wedge? And
I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, and like, yes, that's a fair point. But what I also think that it may do is that Aerith, whether it's her confidence and the way that she's reacting to things in Remake, the kind of fixed eyes on the goal that she has in Rebirth, and her relationships with people that she really shouldn't know, the live stream has been able to give her a sense of family. And going back to that train graveyard scene, these were her friends, right? And she was able to sense them through the live stream. So in some way, even though she hasn't had a great deal of encounters with Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge, she knows them. And she knows the meaning to the party as well.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing, is that at the end of the day, they meant a lot to Tifa, Barrett, and even Cloud. That she can. I think Aerith is the perfect example of a spiritual empath.
Yeah.
That she can take on so much around her, whether it be emotions or what have you, and through her connection with the live stream, the people that materialize through it.
It just strikes me that, she's singing about the experiences of all of these, her friends, and then she looks up and she sees the friends of her friends, which is kind of an interesting thing. Like, hey, I'm in with them now.
And that's what I meant by connective tissue, right?
That's really a cool
The
thought.
live stream connects us all. And I think another moment that hit me really hard just prior to that was in the Gold Saucer when they have the dance sequence with Jesse, which I thought was beautiful. And what happens right after that? You see depending on your playthrough. For me, Tifa was in the cloud, and so in the crowd, and so was Barrett. But it really hit me hard that Barrett was crying in the crowd there. But that's what I'm talking about. That's the live stream that Aerith is connecting with, right? She's connecting with her friends and the friends of her friends in that moment. It all comes together. And I think I have to talk about, I think Shoop would be upset with me if I didn't, Barrett and how much I connected with him. I'm a father, oh my God, the entire dying sequence. I think there are flaws. I will agree there are flaws, especially at the end of it. I think they move on from it too quickly. I think there's a little bit of whiplash there. I would agree. But man, everything leading up to that moment, I was a mess. I was an absolute mess. And I wasn't in the original game, I have to admit. Like, I don't know why. Like I said, I played it before Remake, after Remake. I played it before Rebirth. I played Remake before Rebirth. But for some reason, in the original, as much as I thought the dying moment was one of the most powerful moments of the game, it never hit me emotionally in that way. But holy crap, man, when he sees the picture of her, and I think it had a lot to do with the music too. Man, the music was so good.
The music,
I was a mess. I was an absolute mess. They found a way. I rarely cry on stream at games, and I've talked about how at the beginning of this discussion, how I've become more vulnerable over time and allowing myself to open up with games, but it still takes a lot. It still is something that doesn't happen too often where I'm able to like really let go and fall apart on stream. And how many times did it happen this game, Shoop? Like, it had to happen at least 6, 7.
Dying was the first big crash.
I was a mess in this game. Like, I don't know what was going on with me, but I could not stop crying playing this game. It hit me so many times.
There's a scene I think you have all your VOD saved that you'll eventually upload, but all you see, because of his studio green screen, is just like my arm sneak in with like a roll of toilet paper.
Disembodied arm. Like, oh gosh.
I don't want to leave my PC because, especially big spoiler moments like this, I don't want some troll coming in and ruining this heavy moment. So I'm like, do I get up and get this man a tissue? He can't breathe. But it was, I mean, it was the same thing towards the end. Like the trials. The scene where Aerith actually dies, as soon as that materia hits the ground, Drew's just like,
I was holding it together. I was actually holding it together. I think partially because of the reveal, right? Like, you have this hope. You have hope, right? Like, he's fighting off Sephiroth. Is he actually going to do it?
Torn away from you. There was that was it. He was like, oh, she's gone.
Now, whenever I listen to music and I hear like the chime representing the materia dropping, I start tearing up immediately. But in the game, it did take until Genova Life Clinger happened and Aerith's theme White Materia started up, like leading into that battle, because anybody who's played the original, like that's a amazing moment because they don't go to the original battle music. They keep Eric's theme playing throughout Genova. So part of me forgot that, I guess, because I was just so soaked up in the moment. So the moment that it like goes into the battle and the theme begins, I just was like, oh my God, they did it again. And I just fall apart. I fell apart so
It looked like he
badly
was having an allergic reaction
that I
and
couldn't
his face
play the
was so
game.
red.
I couldn't play the game. Like I was, you can see I'm getting my kicked. Like I'm not focusing. Like everything is hitting me. I'm taking damage. And it took me a moment to realize like I gotta pause this game. So I go into the assessment screen and I just sit there for probably 2 minutes listening to the music and just crying.
Yep.
And
And then my arm came through with the toilet paper again.
That was a mess. I was such a mess.
And you can't, I mean, there's too much particle graphics and such to really see, but like his whole mustache was just slimy. Like I look over and he finally blows his nose, and then he like tries to like read the assessment of Genova Lightfinger, and he's just like choking out 2 words at a time reading the assessment. And I'm like,
oh my goodness,
you need a minute to breathe. Like,
yeah.
But that's the thing about like, I get it. Like some people say, like, oh, we didn't need a remake. We didn't want a remake. Well, that's great. You know what? You can still play the original whenever you want. It's not going anywhere. But for people who really wanted to see what else Square Enix can cook up, and they cooked up this, and it was able to give several people this kind of emotional response.
Yeah,
you can't not high five them for that. Like, they did really well. Whether you like it, whether you dislike it, it's connectable. You can connect to it in some way, and you can see that they put so much work into fleshing out what they couldn't do in 1997. Like, even the little changes they changed, like with Dyne, I want to talk about real quick. Dyne did not die in the exact same way as he did in the original. I liked what they did more in Rebirth. Honestly, personally, I know a lot of people are on the fence with that one. I will say I don't like what they did with Palmer right afterwards. That's one thing that Rebirth did a lot of that I was not a big fan of, where there was a lot of tonal whiplash. And I remember like, I remember like messaging B, Eyes on B. I know you had her on.
It's like going from Final Fantasy 10 to Final Fantasy 10 2.
Yeah, I messaged B the night after Drew had done the whole Dyne Death Barrett thing, and I was like, I'm a mess. Drew is a mess. And B was like, yeah, but Palmer. And I'm like, I know. It was a little, he's literally smacking his donk right after while we're still choking. True. And I'm like, why? Yeah. Let me kind of digest it first. Let me digest my emotions.
Yeah, if I had one complaint, I do hope it's something they listen to in part 3. I hope and they did it in the trials. I will say, do what you did in the trials. Like let us sit in those moments. It's okay. Let us sit in those moments.
Well, it really is a interesting commentary on, grief, right? Like life happens, we're brought to our knees, and we can't even grieve because the next thing is calling. And so is it a good sort of an interpretation and forced sort of reality? That there's a conversation about that. But in some ways, I do like that this game is about, no, we're going to keep on going and not thinking about trauma and stress and go to the next mini game, because I think that part 3 is about accepting that moment of grief and loss in every way.
I think that's a really good point. I agree. I think part 3, I'm so curious how they're going to pace it out, because part of me wonders if part 2 was the exploration game. And I could imagine part 3, even though we're going to have access to the Highwind and we're going to have this whole world at disposal, I don't think that's going to be the focus of the game, honestly. I think it's going to be sort of Final Fantasy 16-esque in a way, where ignoring the side quests, but like very much about just this very epic, bombastic closure experience where we're having these weapon battles and everything's coming together, going from major set piece to set piece. I think it's going to be more of a controlled linear storytelling in part 3 to help us perceive that closure and acceptance.
Here's my thing. It's funny that we're all talking about closure and acceptance and such, as far as like, especially with the burial. Here's the thing: at the end of Rebirth, out of the 5 diagnostic stages of grief, the only thing we are given in the end is denial. We're not given any other. And if you think about it, in 97, let's think about it. It makes sense hardware wise, as far as like, oh, she died. Well, now we have to bury her. and you see Cloud's anger in the original. You do see his anger. We don't get Cloud's anger at the end of Rebirth.
Right.
It was almost like they intentionally hid it from us, actually.
I feel like they did. I feel like they only wanted to give us, because of the look back at the original. There is no denial there.
Yeah.
They don't give us a denial period for that stage of grief for Cloud. And at the end of Rebirth, they do.
Which, when you think about Cloud's character, it actually doesn't make sense for him not to go through a denial period. Like, that's Cloud.
That is Cloud.
Mean, that's his entire story.
His
really.
default is denial.
It manifests in the Zack. It manifests in the Zack storyline in the original. But
really?
Why wouldn't it manifest in the loss of Aerith? It kind of makes perfect sense to kind of add that on as a new layer to his denial.
Making it all about Cloud's denial at the end, because he never goes through that in the original. He goes and buries her, and he's sad about it later.
Go snowboarding. Let's go snowboarding, guys.
Let's go. But I think it'll be nice if whatever the third game is going to be called really touches more on the anger, the bargaining, the depression. And then, like Drew was talking about, the idea of the player controlling the memory of his burial.
I think we get Dark Knight Cloud in part 3. That's what I think we get. I think we're getting Dark Knight Cloud. I think his moveset's going to reflect that. I think he's going to have the black materia automatically equipped, and he's going to be a very different character mechanically.
Have you ever played with the dark side materia?
Yes.
So I wonder if that skill set may be...
That's actually a really good point. It's actually in Rebirth too. Dark side's in Rebirth. I forgot about that.
I haven't played much with it, but enough to test it out.
Yeah, that's there. You're right.
It's going to go like anti-Cecil on us.
I think it's going to be sort of a Cecil journey. I think it's going to be Dark Knight to Warrior of Light for Cloud in part 3. I do think that is kind of going to be my personal prediction, and I think a lot of people share this. I think I've seen it elsewhere too. I think the black materia gets placed with the white materia by the end of the game. I think Cloud's hollow materia is going to be filled with light by the end of it, because he's going to put either his memories into it or Aerith's memories or something. Something's going to fill that materia with light again, and it's going to replace the dark materia. And he'll go from Dark Knight to Warrior of Light.
Oh, there you go. They already read our minds and answered our usual wrap-up question.
I know, right?
I don't know what to do. Our usual wrap-up question is, what would they need to do in part 3 to really stick the landing for you? And you guys just literally went point by point back and forth. I was going to ask if I could ask it this time, Wade, but I'll let you make sure that you extract all the information that you want from these two wonderful folks.
This has been an amazing conversation, especially leaning into these stage theory of grief, right? And I think that you've made some really compelling points about the way that we process Rebirth and the way that we can dream about the next part. I think that's some really cool stuff. The beginning of our conversation today was all about kind of our content creator journeys, about authenticity and knowing the boundaries of that. And Final Fantasy VII is also a journey about authenticity, about being filled with integrity, where all of your disparate parts are forged and formed into one cohesive sort of thing. How do you think, and this will be our final wrap-up question, how do you think the remake trilogy specifically is helping a new generation think about their own identity, actualizing who they are, and processing that as struggle comes?
It's funny, I think a lot of people, especially in the newer parts of the series, like whether it be 15 or 16 or remake or rebirth, I see a lot of old heads say like, well, this isn't Final Fantasy.
Sure.
First of all, it's all crap. It's called Final Fantasy, so it's Final Fantasy. But remake and rebirth, especially remake, I have seen be so many people's first Final Fantasy. This is what to us as kids are Final Fantasy 7 or Final Fantasy 8 or Final Fantasy 9. Final Fantasy 6 especially, I know, was a lot of people's first. I think it's doing the people who are playing remake and such like that as their first Final Fantasy is a complete disservice to say things like, well, this isn't Final Fantasy. But don't ruin somebody else's first experience. I feel I relate a lot to that, especially because I connected so much with 9 and everybody said, this isn't Final Fantasy. And I'm like, Well, what is then? It's giving us an emotional reaction, a great story, excellent characters, a world that we want to live in. It's Final Fantasy. And I'm sorry, I just went on a tangent. I completely forgot the question.
Yeah, it's about how is the remake trilogy helping people reckon with their own identities
in the next generation.
In the
For the
next
next
generation,
generation, yeah.
it's giving them exactly what it gave us when we first played these.
Mm-hmm.
And from my own personal experience, it gave me a home and it gave me an escape and it gave me a place to feel safe and to feel comfortable. And I lived in this own little world. Like I said from the very beginning of this segment, these characters were my friends. And now they've fleshed these characters out even bigger. You can relate even more to Tifa. You can relate even more to Aerith. You can really relate even more to Cloud, Zack, Aerith, Barrett. Look at Drew. He didn't cry to the whole dying Barrett thing in 1997, but now he's a dad. And they fleshed out that dad's story, and he was a complete mess. Look what that's doing for those of us who have children, those of us who are older now, or those of us who have never played Final Fantasy before, but are old enough to grasp these emotional, mature moments. They're going to sit with you the exact same way that the Pixels did back in the 90s, how they sat with us. There's no difference. And that's my spiel. I'm sorry.
Good, thank you. Drew, what about you?
Just a heads up.
Oh, you're muted.
It's disappointing to me in a way that more new players aren't playing the 7 remake series from what we can tell based off of numbers, sales numbers and whatnot. It seems like it's not hitting a new audience the way maybe Square Enix expected. And it's a lot of us old heads coming back to the series and seeing it again. I think there's a lot of value in that, as she was saying. We're at different places in our life now, almost 20, or actually almost 30 years later in some sense, to revisit these characters and connect with them in a way that's completely different. Like I connect with Cloud in a much different way now than I did in 97. I connect with Barrett in a certainly much different way now than I did in 97. And it allows us to let these characters, we're sort of actualizing in a different way now, right? Based on that. But I do think whoever is playing this, the new generation, for the first time, what I really respect about Square Enix and what they're trying to do here is they are trying to give those players an opportunity to experience something very similar to us in sort of the pacing of it, right? How things were revealed, the questions, the mysteries, because I think they could have just done it 1-to-1. They certainly could have done that. And I'm sure it would have done well, honestly. It probably would have done very well. But we all would have known what was coming. All of us.
Right.
And I think a lot of people that even didn't play it would know what was coming, because a lot of these twists and turns are almost iconic moments that have been talked about for years.
Yeah.
But what they've done, and some people would disagree, or maybe they don't think it's quite as successful as I think it is. But I do think that they've put enough ambiguity, and I think they've put enough question marks, and they've changed things just enough that there is, as we're playing through it as a new player or an old player, where it's like we don't necessarily know what's coming next. We have that almost like a 3-disc structure of the original. Now, granted, in the original, we could just put in the next disc. But now it still kind of feels that way after part 2, after Rebirth, where it's like, I felt like I just finished disc 2. And what's going to happen next? Like, I think I know. I have some really good ideas on what they should do, but I don't know for sure. And I would really love to talk with somebody that has no knowledge whatsoever of the original Final Fantasy VII to find out like how this is connecting with them, what they think of these characters and what they think is going to come next. Because I bet you for most of them, they're having a very similar journey to what we experienced back in 97 as far as how this story is unfolding.
You can test it out with your oldest daughter.
Right. Someday. I would love to.
He got her on the Segway, and all she wanted to do was mow people down.
That's true.
In Costa del Sol.
Yeah, that's her favorite thing right now.
Me too.
Yeah. But when she's a little bit older, I'm saying like you could, firsthand experience, test it out, like see how she responds to these characters, when she gets to the point where she has the patience to play through Remake and Rebirth. And by then, at that age, more than likely the third game will be out.
I think, speaking of the third game, and we talked about this a little bit tonight, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how this is going to close. And I think a lot of us have some sense of disappointment because we don't have closure yet. But I think we all need to keep that in mind, that this was always planned as a 3-part trilogy from the moment that they revealed it in 2015. They might have thought at one point that it could have been more than 3 parts, or it could have been 4 parts. I don't know. But I think, personally, I think they are always probably thought it was going to be 3 parts. I think it always made sense. And it seems like they're kind of discussing it as that being the fact now in interviews. So considering that, I think in 2 to 3 years, when part 3 is out and all is said and done, I think then we can truly decide what this was. Was it successful? I think if what I have in my head comes to be the reality and they stick to landing, and I think for most people, honestly, that they are going to look back on this series as being one of the most important moments in RPGs, and something that we'll probably never see again, honestly, because I don't think we will. I don't think we'll ever see a remake series on the scale of the 7 remake series ever again. I don't think it's quite successful enough monetarily for Square Enix, and also just the scope of it to have a team spend 14 years, maybe a little less than that, maybe 12 years on one video game series, one story being told. I think it's kind of miraculous that this happened in the first place. And I think we all should be incredibly grateful that it did happen. If you are a 7 fan, I don't think you should be looking at this being like, they changed this, they changed that. You should be looking at this as a once in a generation, maybe even once in gaming moment that will probably never happen again. And it happened for you and your favorite game of all time, potentially. And I think we should be very grateful of that, especially if they stick the landing with part 3.
Well, I'll tell you, I've got students that did not give a rip about Final Fantasy. They started with 7 Remake and Rebirth. In fact, a couple of them the other day were saying, I wish I was more of a Tifa, but I know I'm an Aerith. And the other one was like, I'm exactly the opposite. Like, I wish I could be more optimistic and confident, but I know that I've got this quiet confidence. I was like, that's amazing. One of them even cosplayed as Aerith. I was like, what is your life? These were not gamers, by the way, beforehand. They just, so the mysteries are hitting for them. A lot of us, as you said, old heads are like, could they ever understand the Zack stuff? And it's like, that's a normal mystery in the storytelling for them.
Yeah,
they don't have to worry about that. So
I'm so happy you said that. You're right. We experienced that same thing back in 97. Like, we didn't know who Zack was. A lot of us didn't even see Zack in the original. He was a freaking optional cutscene for the most part. So it's keep that in mind. Like, these
but it was a game with
figure it out. Yeah,
it was a game with closure, and now it's a delayed closure, and we'll get there. Well, Droogle, Shoop, we are so grateful that you have spent so much time with us today and just answered so many questions. Really got me thinking about this whole idea of the stages of grief, and I'm really, really excited for what is to come in part 3 now. Tell us, where can we find you? Where can our audience see more of your content? And do you have anything coming up for us to look forward to?
What's coming up next?
Yeah.
Well, you can find me at twitch.tv/RidezShoopUff. It's RIDEZESHOOPUF.
We'll link.
And I figured I'd spell it because you don't wake up every morning just knowing how to spell RidezShoopUff.
And we'll put it in the comments as well.
Thanks.
So.
But I don't make any, like I said, any pre-recorded content. Every once in a while you might see a TikTok clip or such, but other than that, I am just only on Twitch. I live stream 4 days a week,
Awesome.
Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and I'm usually playing, if not Final Fantasy, I'm playing some form of emotional visual storytelling that will make me cry. Abzu Journey, The Pathless, Neva, which is coming up on October 15th. I'm going to be playing the crap out of that game. They also made Grease. I love that studio.
Awesome.
So yeah, that's what I'm usually doing.
Awesome.
It's a good time.
What about you, Drew?
Well, you can find me on Twitch at twitch.tv/Droogle, DROOGLE. I'm also on YouTube at youtube.com/Droogle, and I'm trying to get better about TikTok, although that one is Droogle TV. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we're doing a big Kingdom Hearts journey right now. We're going first time ever through the entire series. My goal to understand it.
Gosh.
And I'm also, for the first time ever, going through the entire Legend of Zelda series. So we've done the first one. We did Zelda 2 Adventure of Link, Link to the Past, Link's Awakening, and now we are on Ocarina of Time, iconic Ocarina of Time. We're doing it.
Have fun in the water temple. Good luck. Bye.
We just finished it. We finished it. We did it. Good. Yeah. I liked it. I like the water temple.
It was a nightmare as a child.
As a child, it was brutal. Yeah.
I didn't like Bongo in the Shadow Temple, but I did like the water temple a fair bit. I thought that was very cool. But as I talked about earlier, like I grew up on Final Fantasy, and so much of what I streamed on Twitch, but as a streamer, you do need to think about switching things up. And I did Final Fantasy, especially recently, for such a long time when I rebranded as Droogle, that I thought it was time to mix it up. So as much as Zelda and Kingdom Hearts are RPGs in their own sense, right, and they stay within that wheelhouse, I thought it was time to move on to some different series, and we're having a really, really great time with it so far.
It's awesome.
Well, that's great. And like I said, we are so grateful that you are you took time to be a part of this lecture series. If you have enjoyed the conversation today, make sure you head on over to their channels. We've got the links in the comments. Give them a like, a follow, a subscribe, and all that kind of stuff. And also, while you're here on this channel, make sure you remember to like and subscribe here right on YouTube. We are continuing with our Final Fantasy VII Rebirth lecture series. Stay tuned for more lecture plays and more content creator interviews just like this. Until next time, my friends, that's it from us. So walk tall, and we'll see you in class.
Bye,
Thank you.
everybody. Thank you guys again. Big thanks to Droogle and Shoop for the great interview. Thanks to Husky by The Geek for the use of our theme music. Thanks to Nick Smith for doing our graphics. And most of all, thank you for listening, for watching. This show is brought to you by viewers like you, and we appreciate you. So we hope you're having a great week, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Bye-bye.